In 1904, a former state senator named William Reynolds stacked 1 million electric light bulbs inside a single amusement park on a strip of sand in Brooklyn. The park cost $3.5 million, serious money, the equivalent of well over $100 million today, and its centerpiece was a tower modeled after the Giralda in Seville, 375 feet tall, studded with 44,000 bulbs of its own, burning at $1 a minute in electricity. You could see it from Manhattan. Ships could see it from the Atlantic. The city actually ordered Reynolds to remove the rotating searchlight at the top because its alternating red and white beam was confusing sea captains who mistook it for the Norton Point Lighthouse and risked running their vessels aground on the beach. That's how bright it was. That's how much light you could buy with $3.5 million in 1904. 7 years later, on the morning of May 27, 1911, every one of those lights was dark. A lion named Black Prince was shot dead by police on Surf Avenue. 80 animals lay burned in the wreckage. The tower that had been visible across 2 boroughs burned like a candle for 30 minutes before it collapsed at 3:10 in the morning in what one witness called a spectacular fiery crash. By dawn, Dreamland, the largest, most expensive, most ambitious amusement park in the United States, was a field of smoking rubble, and the age it represented was already beginning to end. But to understand what was lost that night and why it was never rebuilt, you have to understand what Coney Island was before the fire. And what Coney Island was before anything else was a real estate play. The name comes from the Dutch, Coney Island, Rabbit Island, for the rabbits that ran wild across its dunes. For most of its history, it was exactly that, a sandbar, technically an island, separated from the Brooklyn mainland by a shallow creek, facing the open Atlantic. The first hotel opened in 1829, but getting there required either a private carriage or a steamship, which kept it exclusive almost by accident. Coney Island's transformation into something bigger began, as so many American transformations do, with a railroad. Between the end of the Civil War and the late 1870s, 5 separate rail lines were built connecting Coney Island to Brooklyn and through Brooklyn to Manhattan. 5. That's not a transportation plan. That's a land rush. Each railroad was backed by a different set of investors, and each set of investors had its eye on a different stretch of beach, because Coney Island was not one place. It was at least 3. At the eastern end was Manhattan Beach, the creation of Austin Corbin, a railroad magnate and banker who bought 500 acres of salt marsh and built the Manhattan Beach Hotel in 1877, a Queen Anne showpiece designed by J. Pickering Putnam. 4 stories, 150 rooms, fireworks on the beach, and John Philip Sousa conducting the band. Former President Ulysses Grant showed up for the grand opening on the 4th of July. The Union League Club, the University Club, and the New York Club all used it as their summer headquarters. Corbin's vision was explicit. This would be a resort for what he called the highest social element. He was also a notorious anti-Semite who publicly announced his intention to ban Jewish guests, which caused an uproar but didn't stop the money from flowing. In 1880, Corbin added the Oriental Hotel next door, even bigger, even grander. His railroad delivered customers straight to the lobby. A mile to the west sat Brighton Beach, developed by William Engeman, a man who'd made his fortune selling horses to the government during the Civil War. Engeman's Brighton Beach Hotel opened in 1878, aimed at the upper middle class. Not quite as exclusive as Corbin's operation, not quite as expensive, but still respectable. The problem with the Brighton Beach Hotel was that Engeman had built it too close to the water. By 1888, the Atlantic was eating the shoreline so aggressively that the ocean threatened to swallow the building whole. So Engeman did something remarkable. He hired a crew to jack up the entire 6,000-ton structure, set it on railcar flatbeds, and pull it 500 feet inland using 6 steam locomotives. It took 24 hours. The hotel survived. The ocean kept coming. And then there was West Brighton, the part of Coney Island that had no patron, no grand hotel, no pretensions to social exclusivity. As early as 1881, the New York Times described the peninsula as ranking first among the pleasure resorts popular with the masses, and noted with some awe an invasion of 75,000 visitors on a busy summer day. West Brighton was where most of them went. Dance halls, beer gardens, bathhouses, shooting galleries, boxing matches, gambling dens, brothels. The Elephant Hotel, a building shaped like an actual elephant, 7 stories tall, opened in 1882 and became so associated with prostitution that the local expression for visiting a brothel became seeing the elephant. West Brighton was loud, cheap, wild, and enormously profitable. It was the part of Coney Island that made the East End blush and the newspapers rich with outrage. They called the whole peninsula Sodom by the sea, but they meant West Brighton. Presiding over all of it, the luxury and the vice, the racetracks and the brothels, the hotels and the beer gardens, was a man named John Y. McCain. Born in County Antrim, Ireland, McCain came to the town of Gravesend as an infant and grew up to become its constable, then its commissioner, then its absolute ruler. He was a carpenter by trade, a churchgoer by habit, and a crook by vocation. McCain controlled every business permit on Coney Island. He extracted tribute from every saloon, every gambling parlor, every bathhouse. When Austin Corbin wanted to expand his resort, McCain arranged for 200 of his men to attend the town meeting and vote in favor, and Corbin purchased 100 acres of waterfront property for $1,500, land worth $100,000. McCain profited from the brothels he publicly condemned. He rigged every election in Gravesend for the better part of 2 decades. The voter rolls included names like Ernest Look, Charles Faker, and Eugene Easy. In the 1893 election, McCain submitted 2,700 votes from a town with 1,700 registered voters. That was the year his luck ran out. When a reformer named Alexander Bacon arrived at Gravesend Town Hall on Election Day with a court injunction ordering McCain to allow Republican observers to inspect the polls, McCain clasped his hands behind his back, looked Bacon in the eye, and said 4 words that would make front pages across the country. Injunctions don't go here. His police beat the observers with nightsticks, arrested them for drunkenness, and threw them in jail. The Brooklyn Eagle ran a special edition with McCain's quote as the headline. He was indicted in December, convicted in February 1894, and sentenced to 6 years of hard labor at Sing Sing. The fall of McCain opened Coney Island's next chapter because among the people he had tormented was a local businessman named George Tilyou. Tilyou had grown up on Coney Island. His father ran a bathhouse and restaurant on the beach, and he'd been selling sand to Midwestern tourists in souvenir bottles since he was 14 years old. He testified against McCain in an 1887 state investigation and was rewarded with relentless harassment, trivial arrests, interference with his business, thugs at his door. With McCain finally in prison, Tilyou could operate freely for the first time. And Tilyou had an idea. In 1893, he'd visited the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and seen the original Ferris wheel, 264 feet tall, the engineering marvel of the fair. He tried to buy it. Somebody else had already signed the contract. So Tilyou did something that tells you everything about his character. He went home to Coney Island and erected a sign on an empty lot that read, "On this site will be erected the world's largest Ferris wheel." He built a smaller one. It worked. People came. By the mid-1890s, Tilyou owned a theater, a Ferris wheel, and a scattering of mechanical rides along the beach. Then, in 1897, he pulled them all behind a single fence at West 16th Street and Surf Avenue, charged 25 cents for admission to 25 attractions, and called the whole thing Steeplechase Park. It was not the first enclosed amusement park at Coney Island. Captain Paul Boynton had opened the small Sea Lion Park 2 years earlier, the first place in America to charge admission at the gate and offer a curated set of attractions inside. But Steeplechase was the first one built on the principle that would define the industry for the next century. Control the gates, control the experience, control the money. Tilyou understood something about crowds that nobody had articulated so clearly before. His customers, he realized, were happy to play the fool to entertain each other. The signature ride was the steeplechase, mechanical horses racing each other on parallel steel tracks across a curving course. But the real genius was what happened after. Riders were funneled through the Pavilion of Fun, where hidden air jets blew women's skirts up, dwarves prodded men with electric cattle prods, and the crowd in bleachers laughed at all of it. The cruelty was the product. Tilyou's grinning logo, the funny face, a wide lunatic smile with too many teeth, stared down from every surface, and it was, in a way, the face of every paying customer. Steeplechase was an immediate hit. On a hot summer day in its peak years, it drew 90,000 people. In 1907, Steeplechase burned to the ground. Everything, rides, buildings, the Pavilion of Fun, gone. Tilyou walked out to the smoldering lot the next morning and erected a sign that read, "I had troubles yesterday that I have not got today. To inquire about them will be useless. Admission to the burning ruins, 10 cents. He charged admission to the wreckage. Then he rebuilt the entire park, bigger than before, and reopened the following season. That was what you did at Coney Island in 1907. Your park burned, you rebuilt, you opened the gates. Remember that." The success of Steeplechase did what success always does in real estate. It attracted competitors with bigger ambitions and deeper pockets. The first to arrive were Frederic Thompson and Elmer "Skip" Dundee, a pair of theatrical entrepreneurs who had made their names at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo with an illusion ride called A Trip to the Moon. George Tilyou hired them to run the ride at Steeplechase for the 1902 season. At the end of the summer, Tilyou offered them a lower percentage of the take for the following year. They declined, and instead leased Captain Boynton's struggling Sea Lion Park next door, along with the adjacent lot where the old Elephant Hotel had stood before it burned. That gave them 22 acres. They spent $700,000 rebuilding the entire thing from scratch, though Thompson, who was a born promoter, claimed in the press that they'd spent $1 million. When Luna Park opened at 8 o'clock on the evening of May 16, 1903, Thompson threw the switch that illuminated 250,000 electric light bulbs, and the effect on the crowd was something close to religious. Most of these people had never seen electricity used for pure spectacle. Their homes, if they had electricity at all, might have had a single bulb hanging from a cord. Now they were standing inside a city of light. 1,000 red and white spires, minarets, towers, domes, all outlined in fire, reflected in the lagoon at the center of the park. Some accounts say the lights could be seen 30 miles out to sea. The phrase, "lit up like Luna Park," entered the American language that summer and stayed for a generation. Between 8 and 10 that first evening, an estimated 60,000 people streamed through 5 entrance gates staffed by women in white gowns and red feathered hats, buying tickets at ornately carved chariot booths, each one hand-carved by Marcus Illians, a master carver of carousel horses who operated a shop on Dean Street in Brooklyn. Admission was 10 cents. The major attractions, A Trip to the Moon, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, cost a quarter. These were not carnival rides. They were immersive theatrical experiences on the scale of a World's Fair, dropped into a 15-block stretch of Brooklyn beachfront, and you could reach them for the price of a train ticket. Thompson had a philosophy about what he was building. He believed that ordinary people, factory workers, shop clerks, immigrants who'd been in the country less than a year, wanted the same thing that rich people got at the opera or the Grand Tour: transportation to another world. Luna Park was that other world. Its architecture was deliberately unreal, No right angles, no familiar shapes, nothing that reminded you of the tenement you'd left that morning. If Dundee saw visitors sitting down to rest, he'd send a group of musicians over to get them back on their feet. You were not supposed to stop moving. You were not supposed to think. You were supposed to spend. And they did. By the 4th of July, barely 7 weeks after opening night, Thompson and Dundee had paid back everything they had borrowed. By the end of the first season, both men were wealthy. By 1907, Luna Park employed 1,700 people and was illuminated by 1.3 million electric lights at a cost of $5,600 a week. It had its own telegraph office, its own radio office, its own long-distance telephone service. Visitors were mailing more than 1 million postcards a week out of the Coney Island post office. Someone, perhaps Thompson himself, coined a phrase that stuck. Luna Park was the most human thing that God ever permitted the devil to make. The park was, in almost every meaningful sense, a city within a city. And sitting across Surf Avenue, watching every one of those lights blaze, was William Reynolds. Reynolds was a Brooklyn real estate developer, a former Republican state senator, and a man who had made a fortune developing whole neighborhoods: Bedford, Borough Park, Bensonhurst. He was not a showman. He was a deal maker. And what he saw in Luna Park was not a fantasy. He saw a rate of return. If Thompson could earn back $700,000 in a single season, what could $3.5 million produce? Reynolds moved fast. He began quietly buying land through intermediaries so no one would know his plan, a standard real estate tactic that he'd perfected in Borough Park and Bensonhurst, where he'd once built over 1,000 homes in a single development. He paid $447,500 for parcels at Surf Avenue and West 8th Street, another $180,000 for a pier on the beach. By December 1903, construction was underway. The entire park was built in less than 6 months, the only known instance, people said at the time, where a place of entertainment of that magnitude had been completed so quickly. On May 14, 1904, Dreamland opened its doors. Reynolds sat on one side of Surf Avenue. Thompson and Dundee sat on the other. Each watched the other's park with nervous anticipation. Unlike Luna's carefully staged debut, the lights precisely at sunset, the sense of revelation, Dreamland simply threw open its doors before noon and started selling 15-cent tickets. That evening, cold weather and a thick fog kept the crowds thin. It was not the opening Reynolds had wanted. But it wouldn't matter. On the nights when the weather cooperated, the crowds came. 135,000 on opening weekend by some counts, and everything about Dreamland was designed to outdo Luna Park by a factor of 4. Luna had 250,000 lights. Dreamland had 1 million. Luna's tallest structure was its 200-foot electric tower. Dreamland's beacon tower rose 375 feet, a white column studded with 44,700 bulbs visible across the harbor. Luna was 22 acres. Dreamland was 15, but it was denser, more elaborately designed, faced in artificial stone rather than plaster, with broad promenades flanking a central lagoon. The architecture was harmonious, symmetrical, classical. Reynolds wanted refinement, where Thompson had offered chaos. The attractions matched the ambition. Fighting the Flames was a full-scale simulation of a tenement fire, complete with a 6-story building, real firefighters, and women leaping from windows into nets. The End of the World promised exactly what it advertised. A boat ride called Creation told the story of Genesis across an enormous painted dome. Lilliputian was a miniature city of 300 little people, complete with its own town hall, fire department, and theater, where visitors paid to watch the residents go about their daily lives. A concept that would strike most people today as something between bizarre and cruel, though the performers were paid. Captain Jack Bonavita ran a wild animal show with lions and bears. One of the bears was named Theodore Roosevelt, and the menagerie drew steady crowds. And then there was the strangest attraction in all of Coney Island, and possibly the most important, the infant incubator exhibit. A man named Martin Coney, who claimed to be a doctor, though recent scholarship suggests he may never have held a valid medical license, had been displaying premature babies in glass and steel incubators since the late 1890s. He set up permanent exhibits at both Luna Park and Dreamland in 1903 and 1904. Visitors paid 25 cents to file past the incubators and watch the tiny skeletal infants, dressed in doll clothes and knitted bonnets, fighting for life. It sounds grotesque. It was, in fact, life-saving. Hospitals in 1904 considered premature babies hopeless cases. Most didn't own a single incubator, and those that did often charged fees that working families couldn't afford. Coney never charged the parents a cent. He funded the entire operation, the wet nurses, the trained technicians, the round-the-clock care, with admission fees from the sideshow. Outside, barkers called to the passing crowds to draw them in, competing with the noise of the roller coasters and the animal shows. In 1922, one of those barkers was a young British actor named Archibald Leach, who would later change his name to Cary Grant. Coney's success rate was 85%. By the time his exhibits finally closed decades later, he had treated roughly 8,000 babies and saved, by most estimates, the large majority of them. But Dreamland, for all its brilliance, had a problem that Reynolds, the deal-maker, not the showman, never quite solved. The public preferred Luna Park. Luna was louder, wilder, more chaotic, more fun. Dreamland's architectural pretensions were, frankly, lost on a crowd that had come to be thrilled, not educated. Gate receipts never covered the lavish construction costs or the top-heavy management, which was filled with political appointees who owed their jobs to Reynolds's connections rather than any talent for entertainment. By 1908, Dreamland was offering free admission on weekdays to boost attendance. By 1909, the owners had promoted Samuel Gumpertz, a genuine showman who'd been running Lilliputian, to general manager, essentially admitting that the original management had failed. Dreamland was gorgeous, it was unprecedented, and it was bleeding money. And then came the night of May 27th, 1911. The Memorial Day season was about to begin. Workers were rushing to prepare the rides for opening day, which was just hours away. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, a crew was working inside Hell Gate, a boat ride through dimly lit caverns in which visitors drifted past scenes of damnation, a miniature Hades decorated with tar-painted flames and lit by hanging bulbs. In the darkness, someone kicked over a bucket of hot pitch. Some accounts say a light bulb exploded near the spilled tar. Either way, the fire caught instantly, and it spread with a speed that astonished everyone who witnessed it. Hell Gate was made of wood and plaster and paint, as was nearly everything else in Dreamland, as was nearly everything else at Coney Island. These were buildings designed for spectacle, not permanence, and they burned the way tinder burns. Fire Battalion Chief William Rogers arrived, took one look at the blaze, and ordered a second alarm. He ordered 3 hose lines connected to the high-pressure hydrants that had been installed specifically for Coney Island. The pumping station had been tested just the month before, 5 pumps delivering 4,500 gallons per minute at 125 pounds of pressure. It should have been enough. When the nozzles opened, the streams hit the flames, and then began to fall short, then shorter. Something had gone wrong with the water pressure. Nobody could figure out what. Chief Rogers called a third alarm at 2:06. By then, the fire was spreading in both directions from Hell Gate, carried by the breeze, leaping from building to building across Dreamland's wooden bones. The animals were the first catastrophe. Captain Bonavita's menagerie held lions, leopards, bears, and dozens of other creatures, and the fire was heading straight for them. Handlers tried to move the animals, but panicked beasts don't cooperate. Some escaped. Witnesses reported lions running loose on Surf Avenue while firefighters battled the blaze. A lion known as Black Prince, one of 7, along with Sultan, Caesar, Havana, Prince, Spitfire, and Susie, was shot and killed by police on the street. 80 animals died in the fire. Tens of thousands of bullets blasted through the air as cartridges in the shooting galleries cooked off in the heat. One account described the sound as a volcano erupting. The beacon tower burned like a Roman candle. That white column, the one visible from Manhattan, the one that had confused sea captains, now sending up a finger of flame that could be seen across all of Brooklyn. Crowds began gathering from miles away, drawn by the eerie red glow. Police set up lines a mile from the fire, but the spectators kept coming. By 2:30 in the morning, rapid transit trains were delivering thousands of sightseers, and the boulevards leading to Coney Island were jammed with automobiles. At 3:10, the tower came down. By dawn, it was over. Around 200 buildings had been destroyed. Dreamland itself and 4 surrounding blocks of booths, restaurants, hotels, and moving picture theaters. 2,000 concessionaires and employees were homeless. The loss was estimated at between $2 and $3 million. Coming on the eve of the season's first great holiday weekend, the financial damage was compounded by the loss of what should have been the most profitable days of the year. One fact cut through the devastation. No one was killed. 200 employees had still been inside Dreamland when the fire broke out, and all of them escaped. And the incubator babies, every single one of them, were carried to safety by police, led by Sergeant Frederic Klink, who went into the burning building multiple times. Early newspaper reports said the babies had perished. The papers printed corrections the next day. Coney moved his operation across Surf Avenue to Luna Park and kept saving lives there for another 32 years. Reynolds never rebuilt. The park was underinsured, a staggering oversight for a $3.5 million investment, though perhaps less surprising when you consider that the entire park had been built in 6 months by a man who thought of himself as a deal maker rather than an operator. The land sat vacant. Nearly a decade later, Reynolds, who still owned most of Dreamland's bonds, used his political connections to sell the site to New York City for $1.8 million, a price above its assessed value of $1.5 million. He had lost the park, but managed to squeeze a final profit from the deal. The city eventually built the New York Aquarium on the spot. It's still there. What happened to Coney Island after Dreamland burned was not a collapse, not immediately. In some ways, the next decade and a half brought even larger crowds than the golden age of the 3 great parks. Nathan Handwerker, a Polish immigrant who had been slicing rolls at Charles Feltman's restaurant for $11 a week, opened a hot dog stand of his own in 1916 at the corner of Surf and Stillwell Avenues. Feltman charged a dime for a Frankfurter. Nathan charged a nickel. He undercut the man who had invented the Coney Island hot dog by 50%, and the stand, Nathan's Famous, eventually became one of the most recognized brand names in American food. It's still on that corner. Then, in 1920, the subway arrived. The BMT line opened a station at Stillwell Avenue, and the nickel fare, 5 cents from anywhere in Manhattan or Brooklyn, turned the peninsula into the most accessible beach in the United States. Before the subway, getting to Coney Island required a steam railroad ticket and the better part of an afternoon. Now, a garment worker on the Lower East Side could be standing in the surf within an hour of clocking out. The effect was immediate and staggering. On a single hot day in the summer, 1 million people might pour onto the sand. The beach itself, in photographs from the 20s and 30s, looks barely believable. A solid carpet of human bodies, shoulder to shoulder, stretching to the waterline, so dense that finding a patch of sand to sit on required arriving before noon. The Riggleman Boardwalk, 2.5 miles of wooden planking, was completed in 1923, and the city raised 175 businesses to widen the streets that fed it. The Wonder Wheel went up in 1920, 150 feet tall, 200 tons of steel, invented by a man named Charles Herman and built by the eccentric Ferris Wheel Company, which was a real name for a real company. The Cyclone, a wooden roller coaster built for $100,000 by Harry Baker and Vernon Keenan, opened on June 26, 1927, and it could hit 60 miles an hour with an 85-foot drop. That ride still operates today. The era they called the Nickel Empire. Everything cost 5 cents. The subway, the hot dog, the sideshow drew more human beings to this 2-mile stretch of beachfront than had ever gathered at any recreational destination in the history of the country. But the character of the place had changed. Nobody tried again to build what Reynolds had built, a grand, enclosed, architecturally unified park meant to rival the great entertainment destinations of Europe. What replaced Dreamland was cheaper, smaller, more temporary. Independent ride operators, concession stands, sideshows, penny arcades. The aspiration was gone. What remained was the crowd, and the crowd didn't care about architecture. The crowd wanted a hot dog, a swim, a ride that scared them, and a train home. The Nickel Empire was democratic in a way that Dreamland never was, and that was its virtue. But it was also impermanent in a way that Dreamland, for all its flammability, had never intended to be. Luna Park across the avenue lasted 3 more decades, but it was never the same after Frederic Thompson. Skip Dundee died in 1907. Thompson ran the park alone, spending lavishly, promoting ceaselessly, but his finances spiraled. He went bankrupt in 1912 and lost his lease, though he continued to manage the park for its creditors. He died in 1919 at the age of 46. Broke, exhausted, the man who had built the electric Eden used up by his own creation. The park changed hands several times, deteriorated through the Depression, creditors foreclosed on it twice, and then in August 1944, fire came for Luna Park, too. A series of blazes destroyed what was left of Thompson's city of spires. The 1.3 million lights went dark for good. The site became a housing project. Steeplechase, the first of the 3 great parks, the one George Tilyou built, outlasted them all. After Tilyou died in 1914, his family ran it for another 50 years, continually updating the rides, keeping admission prices low, following Tilyou's founding principle that if you made people laugh, they'd come back. In 1941, they bought the parachute jump from the 1939 World's Fair and moved it to the boardwalk, where it became the tallest structure on Coney Island and drew 500,000 riders a year at its peak. The parachute jump still stands today. It hasn't operated since 1964, but it's a city landmark, visible from miles away, the last tower left on a skyline that once bristled with them. Steeplechase closed in September 1964. The Tilyou heirs, led by George's daughter Marie, the majority stockholder, entertained bids from local entities, including the operators of the neighboring Astroland Park and the owners of Nathan's Famous, both of whom presumably would have kept it running as an amusement venue. Marie rejected them all and sold the 15-acre property in February 1965 to a real estate developer named Fred Trump. The price has never been publicly confirmed, but most accounts suggest the deal was structured around residential redevelopment, more lucrative, presumably, than another generation of mechanical horses. Trump had no interest in amusement parks. He saw 17 acres of waterfront property and envisioned luxury high-rises, private clubs, the kind of development he'd been building across Brooklyn and Queens for decades. To him, Steeplechase was not a cultural landmark, it was an obstacle. And he had a specific fear, that the city might try to designate the Pavilion of Fun and its iconic funny face as a protected landmark, which would block his plans. So he moved to ensure there was nothing left to protect. On September 21st, 1966, 2 years to the day after the park closed, Fred Trump threw a demolition party. He sent out engraved invitations for what he called a VIP farewell ceremony. Reporters and television crews arrived to find Trump standing in front of the Pavilion of Fun, holding an axe, posing for photographs beside an earth mover, while 4 fashion models in bikinis and white hard hats smiled from the loader. Champagne flowed. Trump distributed bricks to his guests and invited them to throw the bricks through the stained glass funny face, the grinning logo that had watched over steeplechase since 1897, the face that George Tilyou had put up when he was finally free of John McCain's harassment, the face that had survived the fire of 1907 and the Depression and 2 world wars. The guests threw the bricks, the face shattered. One local historian later called it a desecration of an icon. Trump demolished the Pavilion of Fun, but never built his luxury towers. He couldn't get the zoning variances. The land sat empty for years. Part of it eventually became a parking lot, part of it storage for a tree service company. Decades later, it became the site of a minor league baseball stadium. A banner outside one of the new rides depicts 3 figures in a roller coaster. The middle one wears a version of the funny face. Robert Moses, the city's master builder, had already done his own damage. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Moses systematically replaced Coney Island's old amusement district with high-rise public housing projects, bringing in a new residential population while draining the commercial vitality that had sustained the neighborhood for 80 years. The aquarium opened on the Dreamland site in 1957, a perfectly respectable civic institution on the ashes of a perfectly unreasonable dream. The Cyclone still runs at Surf Avenue and West 10th Street. Nathan still sells hot dogs a few blocks away. The Wonder Wheel still turns. A new Luna Park, named for the old one occupying part of the old footprint, opened in 2010. It has 19 rides. The original had a city's worth. What the fire took on that May night in 1911 was not Coney Island itself. The beach is still there, the boardwalk is still there, millions of people still come every summer. What the fire took was the bet. The bet that you could build something magnificent on sand, out of wood and plaster and paint, and have it last. Every entrepreneur who built at Coney Island knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that it could all burn. They built anyway, because the money was extraordinary, and because the crowds were insatiable, and because the gamble, the sheer nerve of stacking 1 million light bulbs on a sandbar and daring the ocean and the weather and the fire to take them, was itself part of the show. Reynolds made that bet bigger than anyone else, and he lost it in 3 hours on a night in May. After him, nobody at Coney Island ever made a bet that big again. The tower that used to confuse ship captains has been gone for more than a century. In its place, at the corner where the beacon once stood, there is a tank full of sea lions at the New York Aquarium. The admission is $17.95. The sea lions do not know what used to be above them. The electricity still costs money, but nobody counts the bulbs.